Welcome to Time to Teach with Tammy, the podcast that gives tips, advice, and suggestions to teachers by a real teacher. So sit back and enjoy, and oh yeah, don't forget to subscribe. Welcome back, and this is a bonus episode, so I don't know if I should call it episode 20. I guess it technically is now, episode 20, and I wasn't even planning on putting this episode out, but today, on the day that I'm recording, it is September 30th, and today is International Podcast Day, so I feel like that needs to be celebrated, and it just kind of hit me blindsided. I had heard that it was coming up earlier in the month, and I've just been super busy with the beginning of school and just life in general. So the time just kind of passed me by, and all of a sudden, I saw a tweet yesterday about today being International Podcast Day, and I thought, oh my goodness. So I decided to put out this episode today as like a bonus episode. So episode 20, so you want to start a podcast. So this is obviously, the show is for educators, but I suppose anyone could use this information. I thought this would be a perfect episode to put out on International Podcast Day, because, you know, we're celebrating podcasts in general. So whether you are a podcaster or a podcast consumer, we need to celebrate. This is such a fantastic way to send out information, to consume information. I'm an avid podcast listener, and I just can really appreciate podcasts. And if you're listening, well, that's probably true for you too. So today's episode is really about celebrating that, and there are many ways to celebrate podcasts. This is one of them. So if you are contemplating starting your own podcast, today's episode is certainly for you. So, I kind of thought about, like what went into my own podcasting experience. And there are really 5 things that I want to talk about today. I'm really hoping to keep this kind of short because this is also coming at a super busy time, which I feel like when you're an educator, there's almost no time that's not busy, but we're ending a bimester. I'm working on getting narratives ready because parent-teacher conferences are coming up, and because these are narratives, not scores, not marks on strands. It's very time consuming because I'm having to type out a narrative on each student. So there's just a lot going on. And plus I'm getting ready to go out to the store pretty soon. So a lot going on. So I really wanted to hit the primary aspects and factors that go into making your own podcast. So number 1, if you are thinking about starting a podcast, you need to start at the content. I would not personally start a podcast just because I want to start a podcast. I think if you have content that you want to share, then that should probably be the driving force behind a really good podcast. I mean, I'm sure there are really good podcasts out there that were started just because someone really wanted to start a podcast. But I feel like when you're very enthusiastic and passionate about the content, then you want to get that information out. And I think that's the best place to start. So I would recommend, if you have content that you're just really passionate about and you want to send out into the world, that's where you want to start with your podcast. That's really where I started from with my own podcasting. I've mentioned this before, so if you listen to the show, then this is probably not new information. But yeah, I started blogging, I believe, in 2011. I was thinking it was 2014, but then I went way back into archives that I had totally forgotten about, and I'm pretty sure I started in 2011. So for me, I have been trying to put out content for a long time, just And let me make this clear. I do not think I have all the answers. In fact, many times I feel like, oh my gosh, I'm so behind. And I see all these fantastic teachers on Twitter and I just see what everyone's doing. I do not have all the answers. I'm not a perfect teacher. I'm not a perfect person. I'm thinking a Maroon 5 song is coming into my head now, but I'm not a perfect person. I'm not perfect in any aspect whatsoever, but I do believe in the power of sharing experience and perspective. I believe that's what we do. When we try to collaborate within schools, this is another way to collaborate. So I really feel like the more educators we have sharing their experiences, we can only benefit from. So this is not about thinking that I have all the answers. I don't believe in that. And in fact, I withdraw a little bit from that kind of anyone who I feel like exudes that feeling, because I think there's something to be said about being vulnerable and also just recognizing that I do have some experience that is going to be unique to me because nobody else is me. Even my twin sister, shout out to my sister, Tiffany, who's not listening, but shout out to her. Even being a twin, I'm still a unique person with my own unique experiences. So we each have something to offer. So it's not about knowing everything. It's not about having all the answers. I think we should definitely always be seeking what others can offer, because there's always room for growth. So it's not about that. It's just about sharing unique perspectives and experiences so that we can grow as a community of educators and our students can benefit. That is what it is all about. So if you have good content, that's not to say that you have to have been putting out a blog or anything like that. It's just saying if you're starting from the content as opposed to, oh, I just want to start a podcast. Oh, I don't know what to start a podcast about. No, if you actually have the content, I think your podcast is going to be much better because of it. So number one, start with the content. Do you have really good content? And again, that's not saying I have really good content. It's just I feel like I do have something that I can share. And I also consume a lot of education podcasts because I want to learn from other educators. So it's that shared experience. It's that collaboration, if you will, slightly, I guess. I don't know. Can you collaborate when you're just listening? I don't know. I guess if you're sharing and listening to each other's podcasts, perhaps you can. But that's what it's about. And then number two, purpose. What is the purpose? What are you trying to do? So this is where, I feel like in so many podcasts can be very, very niche-y type podcasts. So obviously an education podcast is a specific niche that someone who's not an educator is not going to be drawn to this. Perhaps a parent could be. I do feel like parents might be, but your average person is not going to be drawn towards an education podcast. But even within education is so broad. What is your purpose within education? So I'll just looking at my own podcast, I cover so many different topics. My entire purpose with my podcast is I really do want to offer those suggestions and tips that I've picked up along the way. And then also hearing perspectives from other educators. And that's when I bring in other educators as interviews, which I've had very few, like 2. I do have another one planned. It's just, it's been postponed, I think, for like 6 or 7 weeks. But that's my purpose, just kind of like offering different suggestions, advice, maybe the way that I've seen things and done things. There are educators out there. I'm thinking, let's see, if I think about I have a Facebook group, Teachers Who Podcast. I love this group because there's so many, there's not so many, where I think we have 29 members, maybe 30, somewhere around there. So there's not a whole lot of educators in this group, but it's funny because each one has a completely different take on their podcast. So there's, podcasts that are basically just looking at technology. I feel like there are several of those. There's one podcaster who is a history teacher, so he's doing a history podcast. There is I don't know I forget what he's called, curriculum specialist. I forget the exact title, but Brad Schreffler, who I've had on, I forget which episode, I want to say 16, somewhere around there, can't remember. And he does interview type, so he speaks to all kinds of different educators, but he always has the same questions, but it's really neat because he's speaking to different educators, so you get these questions are answered from their perspective. So even though they're the same questions, you're listening to their take on it. So I think his questions are something like, what do you think is the most pressing issue in education? What is something that you do in your classroom that you wish everyone would do? And then what is one teacher who really impacted your life or who you remember really well? So of course, those kinds of questions get varied answers depending on the person, because what you think is the most pressing issue is going to be different than the next person. So I love that kind of format because I love hearing these issues or these questions coming from the perspective of the individuals. So it's really neat. So there's another podcaster who is really just trying to inspire other teachers, and it is very inspirational. In fact, I will listen to his podcast. I want to say it's Teachonomy. Could be wrong. I'll listen to them in the mornings before work. I just find it the most inspirational time, and that is the purpose of the podcast. So it's not a podcast that I'll listen to after, like, let's say after work or when I'm cooking dinner. That's one of my podcast consumption times as while I'm cooking dinner. So I won't listen to it then, because its purpose really is to inspire. And I feel like for me, as I'm getting ready to leave my house and go to school and teach, that's the time where I really need that kind of inspiration. So even though there are so many education podcasts out there, you need to have a purpose. You need to have, within the niche, you need to have it kind of, like, what are you trying to do with that podcast? And there's so many different avenues that you can take. So, number 2, you want to have a purpose. What am I trying to achieve with this podcast? Okay, number 3, something you need to think about is with whom will you host your podcast? I started out with, oh gosh, I can't even actually remember. Who did I start out with? It's one that seems to be falling back on its popularity. But anyway, I started with one that was a free podcast host, and you only get so many hours. And then after that point, you can delete old audio to continue hosting and putting up new content and keep your account free, which I don't want to do that, because I feel like your episodes are one of the powerful things about podcasts is someone can go years from now and listen to an old episode. So once it's out in the world, it's like anyone has access to it at any time. It's not time relevant, as long as you're not doing something like news or, sometimes technology can be time relevant too, because technology changes. So anyway, I switched and I went to Libsyn. I like Libsyn. I have their most economical account choice. It's like $15 US. So that I'm paying about 300 Mexican pesos a month for that. And oftentimes I do get questions of, are you making money? And, I'm not making money. We want to look at it that way. I guess I'm losing money because I'm paying to have my podcast hosted. But you do want to investigate how you're going to host. I do like Libsyn. It's Libsyn. I'm not associated with them in terms of I don't market for them. I don't have any promo codes. I'm not affiliated with them in any way. I'm using their service and I like it. I have also heard of Blueberry. and I've heard good things about their hosting as well. And I feel like you just want to investigate and see what you get with the different services. What I really like about Libsyn is that I should be logged into my Libsyn account to see, but at this point, because I'm putting out pretty much for the most part one episode a week, which usually is I would say a little bit under 60 minutes. I don't even use up my storage that I get with Libsyn. I don't. I have leftover storage every month. So that's nice. So I could actually put out more episodes a month if I wanted to. I can increase what I do with them, but you do want to look at how much storage are you going to need? All of these things are very, very important, right? So you need to know that kind of information. Just investigate. And of course I can always increase what I get. I can increase my package on there with them, and that would increase my storage. Could also increase the statistics data that I get, so all of those things. But one thing I really, really like about Libsyn is the fact that they give me a free page where I can actually put my audio on as well. You don't have to use it. It just comes with the package. You can, if you want to. You might have a separate website where you're putting up your podcasts. But I have been actually using it. So I really, really like that part. And I find Libsyn pretty easy to use. So that's good. I want something that's easy for obvious reasons. And I would say that probably other hosts do this as well. Libsyn has a podcast called The Feed. And this is nice because it's a podcast where I can get updates on what's happening with Libsyn, what changes are they making, because they're always trying to improve. And that's really, really nice. And I'm going to guess that Blueberry and some of these other podcast hosts probably have their own podcasts as well. But definitely if you go, whoever you're hosting your podcast with, you absolutely definitely would want to see if they have a podcast dedicated to their company, which, I'm feeling like they probably will. And you can get a lot of updates and just really good information, and they don't just talk about Libsyn. The feed doesn't just talk about Libsyn. They go into iTunes, or I guess that's Apple Podcasts now. They talk about things like that. They talk about things that are just happening in the podcast world. So, that's really, really nice. Number 3, think about who you would like to host your podcast with. Number 4, this is a big one. Time. How much time do you have? It's just really, really important to figure out your schedule, because podcasting is time consuming. You can put more time into it or less time into it, but it is going to take some time. So if you're someone who, wants to spend minimal time, I feel like you can. I feel like I'm someone who spends minimal time on podcasting, but with that, I'm still going to spend a good 2 to 3 hours on the podcast, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. And this is because depending on what the topic is, if it's not drawn specifically from my experience, then I'm going to do a little bit of research. I typically will research something. I like to be well prepared that way. So just know, depending on what the topic is, it could be heavier research or it could be minimal research, but you're probably going to have some type of researching involved. So that's going to be time consuming. Then you have your actual recording. If you just kind of look at the episodes I have, they usually run 45 minutes to 50 minutes. So that's the actual recording time. So almost an hour right there. And then I like to go back and I do minimal editing. Even if it sounds like I don't do editing, I actually will play back every episode, and I'm trying to listen for any times where I did like what I just did right now. And you'll hear a lot of ums. I don't take all of them out, but I will take some out because I don't want my episodes to be heavy loaded with ums and silences or any awkward thing that might have come out of my mouth. So I do that. And then I type up the show notes. So for some reason, I like to put in the timestamps of when I've talked about specific points. That's pretty much if someone just wants to, I'm only interested in hearing this point, they can fast forward or, just look for that timestamp. It's not necessary. It could be, your show notes could be a quick summary. So that's what I mean. It's how much work you want to put into it and how extensive you want to make this. So yeah, I do the editing, and then sometimes depending on the microphone that I'm using, I might have to go in and I might have to amplify the audio or just, things like that. And I input my intro and my outro, which are separate saved tracks. So, that's, all of that is going to take time. So you need to think about with your schedule, how much time do you have? How much time do you want to devote to it? So I know it takes me 2 to 3 hours a week. I can handle that with my family. Family to me is number one. I don't like to cut into too much family time, but I can do the 2 to 3 hours. I have that time. I can do it. And I really enjoy it. I really enjoy it. So of course, if it's bringing you happiness, of course you want to do that. But you do need to look at your obligations of the week, and do I have the time to even do something like this? Like I said, for me, I do minimal editing, so the whole process is taking me 2 to 3 hours a week. I could probably do even more minimal and get that down a little bit, but I feel like this is pretty minimal. So anyone going into is probably at a minimum going to spend that kind of time. Now, some people really go in there and get all advanced with their editing and whatever else they're doing. And of course, if you have that kind of time, then go for it. I've heard from some podcasts it's podcasts for podcasting, where they really really highly suggest doing a lot of editing, getting it really good. But I feel like if you're an educator, which this podcast is for, I feel like my audience is going to understand. And I can appreciate those podcasts where I'm like, okay, I can tell that it was not that it was a bad podcast, but I can tell that they didn't feel they needed to take out every and every, it was basically, authentic. And I appreciate that. I really do appreciate that and understand that as an educator, as a teacher. I know time is limited, so I feel like my audience too would be understanding about that. So as long as your audio sounds good in terms of I can hear it, it's not too low, it's not garbly, I think that's the most important thing, that people want to be able to just have decent audio. But does it have to be a perfect episode in terms of there's no awkward silences or there's no awkward this or that or whatever? I think we're understanding of that. So you can put more work into it or not, but that is totally up to you. Okay, number 5. So number 5 basically is recording. You have to think about how are you going to record your audio. So what I actually use, and it's free, because if you've been listening to my episodes, I love free. Free is always better than not free. So I use a program called Audacity, and I love it because it's free and it's just so easy to use. So I can go in there, I can record, I can amplify my sounds, I can add some sound effects like fade in, fade out, you can do noise reduction, really, really neat things. I feel like Audacity, for being a free program, is an awesome program. it's the only one I use. Maybe there are other ones I've heard of. I want to say GarageBand is another one, and I don't know if that's free or not, but I've heard that mentioned on other podcasts. But Audacity is great. It's what I use. I can save my files and then go back into them, because I usually don't record a whole episode in one sitting. I'm going back and forth. So that's just kind of how I do it. And so I can keep adding on to it. And then when I go to save it, I can save it as an actual MP3 file. And that's what I end up uploading into Libsyn as an MP3 file. So yeah, you need to know how you're actually going to record it. And, like with anything, there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve, but I feel like Audacity was so very fast to learn and not difficult. Very much pretty intuitive, I'd actually say, because at the very top of Audacity, you have all the same buttons that you would normally see on some kind of audio player, like the sideways triangle for the play button, and then a square for the stop. So, and then the circle, the red circle for record, and then the two lines, vertical lines for pause. So these are all the same buttons that you would normally see on an audio player or recorder. So it's pretty intuitive. It's using all the same symbols that we've seen all our lives. And then the other things that might be a little more in-depth, you kind of pick up after you've gotten the basics down, and then you can kind of add on to your learning, which, like, that's what we always do, right? That's how anything kind of happens. So yeah, you want to have some kind of way that you're going to be recording your podcast. So that's number 5. And I actually have a little bonus, which is number 6, which is networking. Now, this is not necessary, I don't think, to podcasting, but I feel like it's been helpful to network. So this past summer, one of my goals was to really just become a little more active on Twitter. And I'm so glad that I have, because I feel like on Twitter, you always hear about the PLNs, the Professional Learning Network. And it's really true, because I feel like educators are on Twitter. Like, that's where you're going to find them. So it's really nice to kind of connect. But I think everyone who's in the Teachers Who Podcast group, they are ones who either I connected with on Twitter, or someone I connected with, then those were their connections. So they're all, I believe, Twitter related, and maybe a couple who weren't. I'm not even sure. They might all be Twitter connections. So it's been really nice to be able to connect with other educators and, kind of get the word out and learn from them. I started the Teachers Who Podcast Face group because I'm also in a couple of other podcasting Facebook groups, but I found myself having questions that would pertain to actually educators who would be producing podcasts or maybe consuming education podcasts. So I really needed a network of people who fit that description, and I could not find anything like that out there. So that's why I started it. So hey, if you are an educator who also podcasts, you might want to check that out. It's Teachers Who Podcast. I wasn't actually trying to plug that, but hey, perfect space for it. So, but it is neat to have a network of educators who are doing the same thing. So I can always go and ask a question. And on Wednesdays, we have Wednesday Show Share Wednesday. So we'll also share episodes, or recent episodes on Wednesdays. So just really nice to be able to network. And this network is great because it's not just about podcasting. I'm networking with other educators, and I'm learning from them on different aspects of education. And I do these Twitter chats, and it's really